Hello, hi. Good morning, hi. Thanks for joining. You should be able to hear me now, and you should also be able to write to me in the box which you are, which is lovely. Hello, everyone. Great to have you this morning. I'm talking to you from Poland. It's nice and sunny here today. Where are you joining from? What countries are you joining the webinar from? Let me know in the box. Oh, someone else, Poland, Russia, Austria. Okay, plenty of people around Europe. Very nice. Okay, great. Good. I'm happy we have contact, which I think means we can start. And I'll start with a little bit of housekeeping. You will get certificates sent to you this week of attendance to say that you attended the webinar. You can write questions to me during the webinar, but I might miss them because it's moving quite fast, and while I'm speaking I might not be able to read all your questions. So if I miss your question, you can write it to me at the end. There'll be a little bit of time for questions at the end of the session. But I'll also be asking you questions during the session, so I hope you are ready to share your ideas and expertise as well. So as we go through, ask questions. If I miss them, ask me again at the end. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. Oh, someone from Brazil. That's very nice, very exotic. So I'd like to introduce myself. You can probably see from the first slide, my name is Davies, and I'm a teacher trainer and writer, and I work predominantly with young learners, primary and secondary age. Which is really the focus of this webinar. But if you teach younger or older students, then actually assessment is pretty universal, and the things I'm going to be talking about actually apply to any learners of any age group. And this is the first webinar in a series of 5, and I hope you'll be able to join all 5. This one will sort of give you background information. It might be a little bit more theoretical. If you've joined any of my webinars before, you know I like to share lots of practical ideas. And the remaining 4 webinars in this series will be maybe a little bit more practical, but this is to give you an understanding and the background of assessment for learning, which is the topic of the 5 webinars. I chose this picture for the opening slide because I think it sums up how many teachers and students feel about assessment. Assessment in general is quite stressful, it's frustrating, it's quite a solitary activity as well. It's something we tend to think of as doing alone. I wonder what springs to mind when you hear the words assessment, exam, test. Let me know in the chat box how you feel about these essential classroom activities. Nervous, yes. As teachers, I think we're often nervous as well. When I give my students a test, I think I'm as nervous as they are because I want them to do well. Necessary, they're stressful. Burning the midnight oil. Yes. So I think we can agree assessment in general is quite stressful, and I think in the past few years there's been a real increase in the focus on assessment in language learning. In particular, there's more pressure on teachers to measure progress and report on progress, to be able to tell parents, principals, ministries of education, governments, what progress is being made. We are being held more accountable and need to record that assessment is taking place in the classroom. And of course, if we want to give evidence that learning is taking place, then we have to do assessment as well to have convincing evidence. I think the reason there is more of a spotlight on assessment is the global situation is changing all the time as well. So there are more and more standardized exams, and there's more pressure on students to pass these standardized exams to prove their language level. And they're taking exams at a younger and younger age as well. There are more and more tools that we can use for measuring progress. There is Pearson's Global Scale of English, which is a great way of measuring progress. which is really important and really useful for students. And we see more and more focus on assessment in course books as well. We see more and more can-do statements, more and more student self-reflection, and more ways of highlighting what students are learning and what is being learned in the classroom. I think that it's really good that we are involving students more in this process of assessment, and we're focusing more on making sure that students are learning. But this can sometimes cause teachers to feel that they must be assessing all the time. We sort of have constant reminders that we should be assessing and making sure that progress is being made. So I'd like to share an interesting quote with you as we're starting. So I think this is really interesting. So assessment is one of the most powerful educational tools for promoting effective learning. So assessment does lead to effective learning, but it must be used in the right way. There is no evidence that increasing the amount of testing will enhance learning. Instead, the focus needs to be on helping teachers use assessment as part of teaching and learning in ways that will raise pupils' achievement. So I think it's really important to remember that assessment, when it's done well, enhances learning. And this webinar is going to be looking at assessment for learning, which is a way of doing just that. It's to enhance learning. If you're not sure what assessment for learning is, or if you're not sure how to integrate it into your lessons, then you're in the right place. By the end of this series of webinars, you should feel confident to use assessment for learning in your classroom, and also be more aware of the many assessment strategies that you already use. Because actually assessment and teaching, when it's done very well, should be integrated. To start the session then, I've got some questions for you. These are the things that we're going to be talking about during the session. So if you don't know the answers to the questions now, you should know the answers to the questions at the end of the session. I'd ask you to think about the questions, and if you have some ideas or if you know the answers, then please let me know your thoughts in the chat box. So here's the first question. What do you already know about assessment for learning, or AFL? What can you tell me that you already know about it? Yeah, so it's continuous. I think that's really important. So it's not something we do once or twice. We're doing it all the time. Avoiding numeric values, that's very true. It's formative, and for the people who say you don't know anything about it, we're going to be looking at what formative assessment is in a moment. It's individual and personalised, which is true. It's friendly, which is great. I think the friendlier we can make learning for our students, the better and more effective it is. Okay, learning intentions. Okay, great. So the next question for you, key principles. You've sort of mentioned some of the principles already. So for sure, the focus is on process rather than result. Okay, we're going to be clarifying what the key principles are throughout the session. There are plenty of benefits for teachers and students. You've already mentioned one, it's friendly, and I think that's a benefit for both students and teachers. When our students realise learning is friendly, they're less stressed, and that makes our job easier. Checking knowledge and documenting skills, okay. Okay, and the final question, what are some recommended assessment for learning classroom strategies? Now, you've mentioned learning objectives or learning intentions already, and that's a key feature of assessment for learning. Do you know any other strategies that fall under assessment for learning. Monitoring, yeah, so close monitoring. Peer correction is definitely one of the key strategies. Portfolio is good, you don't need a question mark, you're absolutely right, Nastya. Okay, so these are the things we're going to be thinking about today. I'm going to be sharing some strategies with you, and then in the next 4 webinars we'll be going into a lot more detail with each strategy. Okay, plenty of you said that you are not sure what assessment for learning is, so to give you a brief history, assessment for learning isn't new when you think about mainstream education. So in the UK, it's been used since the early 2000s, and it's one way that schools get assessed and inspected. So inspectors come, and assessment for learning is one thing that they're really interested in seeing how the teachers do. So it isn't new. In the UK it's used a lot, but the teachers get a lot of training in it. So the training lasts for a number of years, they get lots of support in it, lots of help. AFL, more recently, we've started to see it in teaching English as a foreign language, so we see it more in course books, and we hear about it at conferences, we read about it on social media. But I think teachers in our context, teaching English as a foreign language, don't really get the same sort of training. I know I didn't when I was training to be a teacher. I didn't learn about assessment for learning. And I think teachers feel a lot of pressure. I think primary and secondary teachers, I work with a lot of primary and secondary teachers who are very committed and really want to do the best for their students. But it's really hard to keep up. And I think assessment for learning is something it's quite big, there's quite a lot to learn, and it's not something you can do overnight. It takes a little bit of time. So don't worry and don't feel like, oh gosh, everyone knows what it is and I don't. I think that's pretty normal. It's something that for our context is quite new, and something that you need help with. So let's have a think about what exactly it is. And someone already mentioned formative assessment. And there are 2 main types of assessment that we use in the classroom, which are formative and summative. And let me know in the chat box, what do you know about summative assessment? Do you know any examples of summative assessment? When does it happen? What does it look like? Let me know in the chat box your thoughts. Oh, don't worry that you're late. A couple of people joining late. Don't worry. Thanks for joining. You haven't missed too much. Yes, so summative happens at the end of a unit or course book or chunk of learning, chunk of content, exactly. And the focus is on product. Perfect. Exactly. So achievement tests at the end of semester would be examples of summative tests. Exactly, and they get a grade. We typically see a grade. So I think you've mentioned everything I've got here in my definition. So summative assessment takes place after learning has taken place. First of all, we teach the student something, and then we give them a test to see if they learnt it or not. And that could be a vocab test at the end of teaching some new vocabulary. It doesn't have to wait right to the end of the semester, but typically we do it to see what did the students learn, did they learn it? The focus is on the outcome, on how much progress is being made, and it involves scoring. You mentioned a grade, and that's usually so that we can show parents or our school principals, we can show that, okay, the students are learning something, this is the percentage or this is the grade that the students got. Yeah, feedback, yeah, exactly. Paul's just mentioned there's no feedback. So sometimes if you give a test right at the end of the school year, and you notice, oh gosh, my students, they've still got problems with this, is there time to give them feedback? Is there time to go back and learn it? Not sure. Okay, so what about formative assessment? What do you know about formative assessment? Ongoing and continuous. Yeah, perfect. What about the difference with grades? Because in summative assessment you mentioned grades. Yeah, exactly, Paul. So feedback used to help the students develop. Perfect. Okay. Wonderful. So here's my definition again. I think you've mentioned everything. So formative assessment evaluates students while learning takes place. And we're looking at things, for example, how the students are reacting to the lesson content, what their learning needs are, so that we can make adjustments to improve learning. So we can do something by the very next lesson. We'll notice something and we think, okay, how can I adjust my teaching plan to deal with this? It looks also at the process of learning, so how the students are learning, and the feedback. Rather than grades or giving scores, we will try and give comments to help the students move forward. So what do they need to do personally to improve? Exactly. So yeah, nice comments. If you know something about assessment for learning, would you say it falls under summative or formative assessment? Thank you. Maria was first. Yeah. Assessment for learning falls within formative assessment. Now, I don't want to give the impression that summative assessment is bad and formative assessment is good. So yeah, there's a nice comment there saying, oh, I do both. And of course, we need to do a combination of both. Throughout their education, throughout their lives, children will have to take tests, full exams. They need to be resilient, they need to be able to cope with these situations, they need to know how to prepare. So formative assessment isn't something that we use to shield the students or to protect them from scary exams, but it's to ensure that learning is optimal. And so we need to do both. And we need to do both because usually we work in a context where we have to give grades. It's expected. And some students respond very well to that as well. Every learner is different. So really we need to use a combination of summative and formative assessment. And I'm sure that you are doing lots and lots of formative assessment in your lessons every day. I'm going to share some formative assessment strategies, and I wonder, do you use these strategies or not? Let me know in the box if you use these classroom assessment techniques and strategies. So I think you've sort of mentioned this already, but how do you adapt your lessons based on students' needs? So say you realise that your students are struggling, what might you do to help them in a future lesson? Yeah. Okay, so plenty of people are using it. So yeah, you might give them feedback. Bringing in more tasks is a very good way if you notice students are having problems. Yeah, exactly. So try and find out what the difficult areas are, what the weak parts are, and focus on those. Games related to the topic, of course, young learners, primary and secondary learners love games. So yeah, okay, so if you're adapting your lessons based on what you notice, then you're using formative assessment. What do you do when your students hand in written work? Do you give them a grade? Do you give them a comment? Do you do both? What's your typical approach? Yeah, okay. Plenty of teachers doing both, some doing mainly comments. Yeah. I write comments, highlight some problems. Yeah, exactly. Okay. And I think both are useful for students. If we just give them a grade, it can be a bit demotivating. Maybe the grade wasn't very good and they don't know what they should do to be better. But if they say, well, you know, my grade's not very good, but the teachers told me the things that I needed to do to make it better, then actually that's going to help them to improve. And I think a compliment, Lorena says, give a compliment, that's also nice. We can't only give feedback, which is saying, oh, well, you should have done this, you should have done this, you should have done this. But yes, tell them something that they're doing well and something that should be better or they could do better. I'm sure you're all involving your students in the lessons. I know that in the past I used to maybe call on stronger students during feedback sessions. But actually, it's really important to involve everyone, even the students who struggle or find English a little bit more difficult. What about this one? Do you monitor students when they're working? If so, you're using formative assessment. What about predicting, brainstorming, and mind mapping? Do you use these? Yeah, and I think these are really useful. They're a way to find out what the students already know. So often when you ask students to brainstorm or predict, you might realise, oh, actually, they're quite confident with this topic or with this language point, and then maybe you can adjust even in the upcoming, in the current lesson. You can think, okay, they're more confident than I thought, so maybe I need to spend less time on teaching and more time dedicated to the students using the language in a creative way. I'm sure you encourage your students to ask questions. I think if you're teaching primary learners, they're full of questions. Secondary learners sometimes need a little bit more encouragement. Giving students an opportunity to share their prior knowledge is also another formative assessment technique, because you're finding out what they already know. You're allowing them to teach each other, which takes some of the pressure off the teacher. If students can teach each other, that's great. And what about, I wonder, do you use can-do statements? We see them in quite a lot of course books now, and we have various tools, sort of descriptors like the Global Scale of English or the CEFR. I wonder if you use can-do statements with your students. Yeah, sometimes, from time to time. More people are typing about the can-dos. In course planning, okay, so that can be a useful tool for teachers as well as for students. Yeah, workbooks have them, yeah, okay. We're going to be talking during these webinars. We'll be thinking a little bit more about can-do statements. Sort of mixed feelings there about can-do statements. They've appeared. What do we do with them? We'll find out. Okay. If you're doing these things in your classroom, there's plenty of other classroom assessment techniques. If you're doing these, then you're already using formative assessment. You're looking at your students' needs and you're thinking, how can I help the students in future lessons? So which is great. Now, assessment for learning falls within formative assessment, but it takes things one step further. Assessment for learning is all about what you do with the information that you learn. When you're monitoring, when you're giving can-do statements, when you're asking students to predict or brainstorm your information. And it's what we do with the information that makes assessment for learning effective. If we use this information to adjust learning, we're using formative assessment. But if we use this information to help students get better at learning, then we're using assessment for learning. Okay? So this information that we gather, we need to share it with our students so they can be better at learning English or whatever it is you're teaching. Maybe it's a different language. So assessment for learning puts students at the heart of learning. It's all about the students. Formative assessment can be quite teacher-centered. It's about the teacher looking, okay, I'm gonna learn something, I'm gonna adjust my teaching. Assessment for learning asks students to think about the learning too. Okay, it's not only about the teacher, it's also about the students. But of course, students need a lot of help to do this. It doesn't come naturally. They can't just take responsibility for their own learning. It needs to come from the teacher as well. Okay, so I want to share some of the main principles with you of assessment for learning. So with assessment for learning, we know that learning is more effective when students understand where they are in their learning. Okay, so that means they need to know a number of things. They need to think about what they already know that's going to help them. So typically, you can ask students, and I think we do this a lot anyway, but we would ask students at the beginning of a topic to think about what they already know. If it's a topic, for example, you're teaching a class about animal camouflage, you might ask students to reflect on what they already know about it. If it's a language point, in English, we tend to teach the same structures at each level, but we build on those structures. I think we teach the present perfect at elementary, at pre-intermediate, at intermediate, upper intermediate. So we can ask students to think about what they already know, and before we then show them what they don't know that they need to learn next. So students need to know, they need to think about what they already know, and then they need to think about what they need to learn next. It's helpful when students know how you expect them to learn. Sometimes we decide, I'm going to play a game to make this language practice more interesting. And students don't necessarily realise that they are learning. So it's about involving students and telling them, okay, we're going to do this activity, we're going to play this game, and this is what I expect. I expect you to use this vocabulary or these structures. And finally, they need to have some help working out if they did well or not. And one thing we can use our success criteria, which we're going to be looking at in the next webinar. But for example, if you want students to do some written work, before they do the written work, you can give them a list of things that you expect from them. So that might be how many words you expect them to write. It might be using some particular functional language that you've taught them. It might be that you want them to work collaboratively with a partner. Maybe they're not very good at sharing their ideas. So before they do the learning, you tell them what your expectation is, so that they can then afterwards think, oh, did I do what the teacher asked me to do or not? So these things are really important. Students can talk about them, they can think about them. It's about asking them the right questions. Maybe their language level is quite low, so maybe they need to do it in their mother tongue, that's fine. If they can do it in English, that's great as well. Another principle of assessment for learning is that students can take responsibility, and they should take responsibility for their own learning. It doesn't have to be all about the teacher. For students to be able to do that, they need to learn how to reflect on their own work and their peers' work. And again, if we make it clear to students what we expect from them, then it's easier for them to reflect. If we ask students to, okay, have a debate with your partner, go. And they have a debate. And afterwards we say, oh, okay, reflect. How well did you do? It's difficult to know where to start. But if we ask them maybe to use some specific language for turn taking, or some vocabulary that they've been learning, then after they have their debate, they can think back about these specific things. So they need help to be able to reflect. We can't just ask students to reflect, we need to help them to reflect. I think that often as teachers we feel like there's so much pressure on us. We're the most important person in the classroom. We're the fountain of all knowledge. And students often see us in that position as well. So they often ask for help before they've really tried to solve a problem for themselves, or before they've asked one of their classmates. So in assessment for learning, for students to be more responsible, they need to learn strategies for coping, learning from each other. And exactly, it lessens the burden on the teacher, which is what I'm always looking for, because we have enough to do. We can't be answering every single question every moment of the day. Students also need help identifying what strategies work for them. We all learn differently. For some students, mind mapping is a great way of recording vocabulary. For others, it's a list. For others, it's a translation. So students need help thinking about what strategies. And that can be as simple as maybe you set up a task, everybody does the task, everybody does mind mapping, and then afterwards you ask them to think, okay, does that suit you? Would you use that in your mother tongue for recording something? If not, okay, well, that's not the strategy for you. And all of these things will help students to become more autonomous and more independent, and takes the pressure, takes the burden off the teacher. And then we've got more time to really observe and think about what's going on. When we're answering questions, it's much harder to monitor, and it's much harder to listen to how well the students are coping. But if the students are working more autonomously, they're getting on with things for themselves, then we can listen much more carefully and see what's happening and where the real problems are. And then, of course, we can help. And my final principle is that every learner is capable of making progress, improving and feeling a sense of achievement. I think when we do lots of summative testing, when we give grades, when we write reports, the natural thing that students do is start comparing each other. Whenever I give back a test and everyone's got their percentage, one of the first things they do is try and work out who got the highest percentage. And then, of course, someone, is also being highlighted as having the worst percentage, which doesn't really help anyone, because, maybe a student didn't get a very high percentage, but maybe it was a very good result for them personally. So that means that students need focused, personalised, actionable feedback. So if everyone just gets a grade, it doesn't help them to get better. It doesn't help with their self-confidence or self-esteem. But if it's more personalised, and if there is something that they can do to improve, that might be revising a particular page in the course book. It might be working with particular structures. But that can help students get better and can help them all feel good about themselves. Again, it's avoiding these comparisons, because I think it's often not fair, especially with young learners, where learning, it's not linear, it goes in fits and starts, it's tied to the level of maturity of the students. So comparing, ranking, I think maybe we have to do it for our school principals, but maybe we don't need to make it so obvious to the students themselves. I don't know about you, but I have some who tend to give up, particularly when I'm addressing the whole class and the stronger students have got their hands up or are calling out the answers. I think it's really important that we create an atmosphere in our classroom where everybody can try, even when it's difficult. And so that's finding ways to not always favour the stronger students, the faster students, but giving them lots of opportunities, first to think about their ideas, then discuss them with a partner before sharing them. Yeah, there's a comment there which I agree with. If we don't compare them, and I'm not saying that it's us teachers who are comparing the students, but it's more the students who compare each other. When they get their test results, they start, who got the best, who got the worst. If we give more comments rather than grades, then it avoids this situation. Sometimes we must give grades, it's unavoidable. But I think if we foster this environment where where students are learning from each other and we're highlighting the strengths of each individual student, then it becomes less important who got the best grade and who got the worst grade. Because if you're praising students not only for their language ability, but maybe for the way they behave in the classroom, or the way they help each other, or the way they're resilient and they solve problems, then students start to see everybody's strength, and they see that everybody has got something valuable to bring to the lesson. Which is really important. So when we are giving feedback or praising our students, then we really need to focus on strategies rather than something that might be, talent or natural ability. Some students are naturally very good at language, but what is it in particular that they are doing well? So rather than saying, oh, well done, you're so good at English, well done, you worked really hard on this particular structure, and I can see the result in the written work or in the test. So more on the process, the fact that they worked hard, or that they tried, they made an effort, rather than simply, oh, well done, you got the right answer, well done, you're very good. Okay. So those are the sort of key principles. I think the most important thing to remember is that assessment for learning involves the student. It's not something that teachers do, it's something that teachers and students do together. And it's something students need help with in the beginning because it doesn't come naturally. But there are plenty of routines and strategies that we can use in different lessons that will train students to be able to do it more confidently. Okay, there are plenty of benefits to students. What do you think are the benefits for students of using assessment for learning, of involving them in understanding learning? Let me know in the chat box. Yeah, they feel important, exactly. Some students get much more attention from the teacher, the noisy ones or the naughty ones, but actually they all feel important. They're getting this immediate feedback to improve. Yeah, a couple of people are mentioning motivation, and it's really motivating. I think sometimes students don't know how to go about learning, but actually saying, oh, this is the next thing you need to do. It's quite a small thing. Then they can go, it's manageable. Increases their self-esteem and their self-confidence. Exactly, they're learning in the moment. It's not deferred. They're not waiting to have the revision lesson and then spend all night revising for the test. Yeah. Motivation, self-confidence. And motivated to keep on learning, exactly. So it's giving them life skills for learning. I think you mentioned everything that I've got. So every student feels a sense of achievement. Even the ones that are less confident, they can notice in themselves. So it doesn't have to come from the teacher. They can notice in themselves the progress that they are making. They become more aware of their own strengths and development areas, which is perfect, so they can use their strengths to their advantage, but they can also focus on the things that they realise are weaker. Learning is less stressful because we're less focused on grades and more focused on progress, which leads to a better classroom environment. When we ask students to reflect and think about learning, we actually give them more opportunities to communicate with the teacher how they actually feel and how they need help with. We're going to be talking a little bit about using traffic lights or response cards for students to be able to show the teacher how they feel, how they're finding learning. So when we give students the opportunity to reflect, we're also giving them the opportunity to think about, oh, actually, what do I need help with? And it helps develop this growth mindset where students realise that it's not about their abilities are not fixed. Whether they're good at language, like learning languages, it's not something fixed. It's something that they can develop, and it's something if they try hard, then they're going to see improvements. So it helps students to develop this healthy approach to learning, that if they try hard, then it will, their rewards will pay, their efforts will pay off. What about for teachers? Because we are also very important in this equation. What are the benefits for teachers of using assessment for learning? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Okay, so for sure we can adjust our teaching. And let me share what I've got. So I agree totally. Students can respond to the needs of their students more quickly. So we don't have to wait until the end of a cycle of work. We respond immediately. And I think it really helps focus on every student. It can be quite easy. We've got a big group, then we sort of lump them all together. But when we use assessment for learning, then we're more aware of each student, the quieter students, the hard-working students, what exactly are their needs as well. Sometimes I find, there's a group of students who, they work hard, they're quiet, they do everything I ask them. But when it comes to writing their reports, I often think, oh, well, actually, I don't know as much about these students as the noisy ones, or the disruptive ones, or the strongest ones who are always shouting out the answers. So we become more aware of every student. And we're no longer responsible for everything that happens in the classroom, so we're giving some of the responsibility to the students. The students are teaching each other more, they're helping each other, they're giving each other feedback, so it takes some of the responsibility off the teacher. That's kind of the theory behind it, the principles behind it. I want to share now some of the key strategies that you can use and that we will be talking about in these webinars. Here's the list. I've cut out some of the words. So can you help me? What is the O in the first strategy here? Learning what? Learning objectives, yeah, or outcomes, or learning intentions. The same name, different names for the same thing. So learning objectives, learning intentions, learning outcomes, letting students know what it is they're learning, why they're learning it, and how they're learning it. What about the second strategy? What S? Exactly, Sylvia was first, so success criteria. And success criteria typically is giving students very specific instructions about how you want them to do a task. And we often use them for speaking and writing, but we can use them for all tasks. It might be the way you want them to go about it, so you might want to ask students to predict before they answer. The next week, the webinar next week, we're going to be looking in detail at learning objectives and success criteria. And it will be very practical with lots of examples of how to use them in your lessons. What's the next one? What is the missing letter? A, exactly. So what is another strategy? We are learning today, or what are we learning today? So again, letting students know the topic and what's coming up in the lesson. I think the next one we all know, we've already mentioned them today. Can-do statements. A little bit of mixed feedback from you about can-do statements, so we'll definitely go into a bit more detail with them and how to use them effectively, when to use them, and how to use them with students. What type of lights? What's the missing T? Traffic lights. Okay, traffic lights can be used in different ways, but typically we can ask students to think about an activity, a lesson, a project, and self-assess. Red for, oh, I'm still having problems, orange for, I'm not sure, green, I'm really confident, I understood, and I'm happy with my work. We'll be talking about those in another webinar. Think, pair, what's the missing S? Share. Think, pair, share. The next one, to, what are the missing words? To what? Wish is the second, 2 stars and a wish. When do we typically use 2 stars and a wish? What type of task? For written feedback. So 2 stars and a wish, give the students 2 things that they've done well and 1 thing that they can do better. So typically for written work, we could use it for projects, for speaking. Formative what? We had formative assessment. This is formative feedback. Well done. So formative feedback is feedback that helps students to get better. It's not giving them a grade, but it's giving them comments, useful information on how they can improve. What about the O in the next one? Good try, Sylvia. It's not outcome. This one's connected to monitoring. The O here is observation checklists. Patricia, 2 stars and a wish. We will be talking about in a future webinar, but it's typically giving students feedback where you give them 2 strengths, 2 stars, well done, you did these 2 things well. So, oh, well done, you checked your spelling, well done, you wrote 3 paragraphs, and 1 wish. Okay, perhaps you can go back and check your past simple verbs. So 2 stars and a wish, 2 positives, 1 thing for students to improve, to revise. Observation checklists are very useful with monitoring. We do a lot of monitoring, and often we use the information immediately. So we notice other students need more time, I'll give them more time, or this pair is having a problem, I'll help this pair. An observation checklist is really useful to keep a record, so you can notice patterns, see which students. Are there some students who always struggle with the same thing? Are the students particularly in one area that you don't need to focus on anymore? And I'll be sharing an observation checklist with you in a future webinar that you can use with your students. What's the P for P teaching? Peer teaching. Pre-teaching is also very important. To teach each other. The students come to lessons, they have so much knowledge, so many ideas, they're so creative. So peer teaching. Learning, what's the missing D? Good try, it's not development. Learning, we have plenty of learning difficulties. Learning diaries. So I'll be sharing with you some ideas for learning diaries. When we ask students to reflect on their learning, they can do that by talking to a partner, but it helps for them to write some notes down, write some thoughts down, because then as you go through the year, you can look back on maybe the problems they had or the things they weren't sure about, and they can really track their progress, and they can see, okay, at the start I didn't feel confident doing this, now I can do it. I didn't used to be able to use this particular vocabulary, now I know how. So learning diaries are a great tool for getting students to record their reflections and then use those reflections to be more aware of the progress they're making. Portfolios, well done Maria, is the next one. So often portfolios and learning diaries can be used together. Portfolios is asking students to select their best work or the work that they're most proud of. So maybe it's not their best work, but maybe it's proud of, maybe there was something in it they did very well. And then the last 2 are the same missing word, you've got it, so self-reflection and peer reflection. And these, I would say, are key for assessment for learning. These are the things that we want students to get better at. We want them to be able to think about their own performance and also the performance of their peers, so that they can give each other useful feedback. So it's not just, students saying to each other, oh, you made 5 mistakes, you're not very good, but they can actually give each other feedback, which is useful for them. So these are some of the key strategies. We're going to be talking in detail about all of these throughout the series. My learning intentions, which I shared with you at the start of the session, I hope you feel more confident about now. So we know a little bit about the history of AFL, but we know the main principles, that it's not only about the teachers, it's about the students, and it's about helping students to get better at learning. So it's not only teachers gathering information and using it, but it's students being able to reflect on their own learning, think about what do I already know, what do I need to know next, how well did I learn it, what can I do better in the future. I think that you very correctly identified lots of the benefits for teachers and students, benefits for all of us. And those strategies, as I say, we're going to be focusing focusing on in plenty of detail. So next week, on Tuesday, the same time, so one webinar in the morning, one in the evening, I'll be talking about learning objectives and success criteria. It's going to be a very practical session on how you can easily, quickly build this into your planning. So none of these strategies are things which take lots of preparation or planning, but there are some little stages, little tricks we can use in the classroom to start using assessment for learning. So I hope you can join me next week. I can answer questions now if you have any. If not, you will receive your certificates of attendance this week, hopefully in the next couple of days. Thank you very much for your participation as well. Great to have so many people commenting. A couple of you are asking about a copy of slides. I'm not sure, but we can get back to you on that one. Great. The attendance certificate will be sent to you via email, so don't worry, it will come this week. So yeah, 2 webinars next Tuesday, the same time. So if this is a good time for you, then join me next Tuesday in the morning. Thank you very much for joining. To sign up for the next webinar, the link is in the slide there. Take a quick screenshot and then follow that link, and you can sign up for the next one. And thank you very much for joining. I hope you have a nice day. I hope you have lovely lessons if you're teaching today. Okay. And perfect. So a comment there, you will be receiving handouts, and I will try to add a reading list to that. Someone just asked about books. So I will try to add a reading list, and you will get a handout from the session. Okay, thanks. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.